Hey, glad you guys can make it to our Tech for Our Lives podcast. I'm your host, Chris, and today we'll be talking about a fundamental federal act that could reshape the future of technology in the United States and change our lives forever, the CHIPS Act. I'm joined today by Yishang and Isha. How are you guys?
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to join the podcast and see you guys today.
Hi, guys. Thank you for having me on the podcast, Chris.
Glad you guys are well. I'm sure you guys can bring some interesting insights into this story. All right, let's jump right in. In the 21st century, computers and smartphones have entered our daily lives. We use them for many aspects of our day, whether it be for work or connecting with family and friends. It seems as though people can't live without them.
Yeah, I can't imagine what I would do if my phone ran out of battery while I was out. I feel like I would be so disconnected from my family, friends, and the outside world.
Yeah, I can't agree more. The current technology is so advanced that it has been integrated into our lives, thanks to the explosion of information technology over the past decades. The invention of the computer is said to be a great crystallization of human intelligence. As a software engineer myself, computer is my means of production and also an entertainment tool.
Absolutely. And that's why we should and will be talking about one of the most fundamental components inside the computer and other electronic products, the chips. And I'm curious about how you guys know about chips, how much you guys know about chips.
Well, chips in the computer, I don't really know a lot about chips. I do know that some big companies produce them, like Intel and NVIDIA, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. From the hardware perspective, a chip, also called a semiconductor or integrated circuits, is a series of electronic circuits printed onto a conducting material, usually silicon. They form the physical building blocks used to make computers and so on software. And manufacturing chips can be very hard, requiring a large investment of engineers' time and money. I think only a few countries, including the US and China, are able to make semiconductors on their own.
Yeah, that sounds right. I actually have the CHIPS summary of the CHIPS Act summary pulled up here. Let me summarize it a little bit. So in December 2020, as part of William Thornberry's National Defense Authorization Act of 2021, Congress passed into law funding programs for the Bipartisan CHIPS Act for America Act, authorizing Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of State activities to develop onshore domestic manufacturing of semiconductors, which we'll explain what semiconductors are in the future, but they're critical to US competitiveness and national security. Only 12% of these chips are currently manufactured domestically compared to 37% in the 1990s, and many foreign competitors, including China, are investing heavily to dominate the industry. The United States also lacks capabilities to produce the most advanced chips of volume. The CHIPS Act of 2022 will provide appropriations needed to implement the currently authorized programs from Bipartisan CHIPS Act for America Act. So yeah, that's a general summary that I found for the CHIPS Act. Let's dive in to some questions I have for you guys. So yeah, let's dive deep into your thoughts and opinions of the CHIPS Act now that you two have a general idea of what the act's about. Let's start with Isha. This act is said to bring electronics factories back to the US, reduce US reliance on overseas chip supply chains, and increase authorizations to boost the nation's science and technology base. What do you think about the prices of computers, phones, and other electronics in general?
I do feel like in recent years, the newer smartphones have been very expensive. I have always been using iPhones, and trying to upgrade my phone yearly is very hard to do since the new iPhone 14 Pro is too expensive for me to buy. Because I'm a college student who takes loans to pay for tuition, I'm trying to make ends meet. Sinking $1,000 into a new phone does not seem reasonable. I think more phones should cost less than they do now for people who are trying to save their money.
Absolutely. Prices of these phones and computers are crazy. As far as I can tell, the current administration believes that the situation in the chips market will become much worse in the years to come if this act is never introduced. The US government believes that when they do not maintain absolute superiority in the chip technology, they will be challenged internationally and pay a greater price. Now, Yichang, how do you think this act will affect the prices of electronic products and the relevant job opportunities?
That's a great question. As Asia mentioned, the price of electronics have been expensive in recent years. But indeed, they have many components like chips, screen, battery, graphic cards. So the price of chips do not necessarily determine whether the products itself are expensive or not. However, we can think the impact of this act on a macro level. From my perspective, in the short run, people will be facing an even more unaffordable chips markets amid the recent recession and high inflation. But in the long term, the act will help the US to advance in the competitions with other countries and promote the development of cutting-edge technologies, and eventually benefit all the people by reducing the price and providing more job opportunities.
Can you explain a little bit more, Yichang? I'm curious how you reached this conclusion.
Sure. Correct me if I'm wrong. Under the provisions of this act, US technology companies which have received federal funding will be banned from building factories with advanced technology in China for at least 10 years. What's more, the US government has made massive investment in technology developments in the field of semiconductors. So in short, this is a bill to protect the semiconductor industry. And the US government wants to maintain the industry's leadership position from being challenged while bringing manufacturing back to revitalize the economy. So competitions in this area will be fiercer than ever in the foreseeable years to come. It must take a lot of time for companies to shut down their factories overseas and transition back to the US. And also, many experts in the field will make decisions. Some will choose to relocate to the United States, while others will choose to quit and work for other international companies, maybe. And now we are facing a potential economic crisis, and inflation is so crazy.
Oh gosh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, you get what I mean. In fact, the US government proposed similar acts targeting Chinese companies producing chips and 5G, including Huawei and Zhongxin as well. And it leads to a considerable economic loss on both sides in the short term. So during these years, people definitely will have a tough time, and chip prices will probably go up as well. But later like this, I say 5 to 10 years from now, the situation will be quite different. Competitions and large investment will make both the China and US advance in the field and lead to technical breakthroughs. I mean, who knows if there will be a new boost in the technology field. If that happens, I believe cheap chips can be accessible by everyone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As long as these companies comply with these restrictions and spend more on their research using federal funding, it should lead to cheaper electronics finally. Besides the semiconductor themselves, there are certain political gains the US government makes this time. Isha, after Yichang's analysis, do you think there are any other positive impacts that will be felt immediately after the successful execution of the CHIPS Act?
From what I've heard, the United States and China have been in fierce confrontation in the economic field for several years, and this act is executed definitely not only because of maintaining technology-led, but also hitting the other side's economic markets. Especially after the pandemic happened, both countries are facing recession and a tougher economic market. If a lot of companies choose to leave the Chinese market, then a lot of jobs will disappear, the unemployment rate will rise, and the future of the Chinese market will become even more pessimistic. Instead, the US will be rewarded by the return of the manufacturing industry, which will go a long way to help the long-term recovery of the country's economy.
That's a brilliant idea. Now, Isha, how do you think companies should respond to such a large act? There's definitely a lot to do from a managerial perspective regarding hiring, supply chain, and what to do with all that money in general.
I think companies being given this money will allow them to build more factories to create more chips. And for these factories, they would need to hire more workers, and this would help create more jobs in the US.
Definitely, Isha. I can see why there are a lot of things need to be done at a company like that after an act like this. Now, Yishang, what are your thoughts on this situation?
Yeah, just like what Isha said, I feel that most managers should deal with the situation wisely to minimize loss for their companies. If I'm the HR, I would transfer the company's related manufacturing to other countries, like in Southeast Asia, maybe with abundant human resources to continue their production, such as India, Vietnam. This will keep the company's manufacturing costs at an affordable level while not losing US markets. They can also offer generous incentives to experts in related fields who are subject to the act, attracting them to the US to remain with the company.
Yeah, Yishang, you make great points here. Considering that producing chips domestically would require companies to build or acquire new spaces for production, do you trust that these companies will take the extra step to make these chips locally?
I do trust that the companies will use the funding that the government is giving them to make the chips locally. Sure, it will take time for them to build and open these factories.
I
can see why you think that way, Isha. Same thing for you, Yichang. Do you trust these companies to take the extra step?
I think at the very beginning, when the act was introduced, some companies may have taken a chance to try to bypass the bill to continue their trading activities illegally. And this requires definitely a regulatory process. Then the companies will come back to the US markets one after another and finally achieve the return of manufacturing.
Yeah, Yichang, that makes sense. Those are some good topics you brought up here. Now, my last question for both of you. The increase of chip availability with this act could lead to a boom in the Internet of Things industry. What do you think are the pros and cons of an increase in this technology, specifically in cars and home devices?
Yeah, I think chips are also having a bright future in the Internet of Things markets. Like in macroeconomics, we see them as complements, which means the demand of the Internet of Things markets will rise together with the chips markets, because the cars, like these things, the hardware things will also use chips as necessary equipment. So I think we can definitely see a brighter future here.
Yeah, what about you, Isha?
I think in the short run, these chips will make things more expensive, but in the long run, as more chips are produced in the US, it should drive down the cost of most technology that we use day to day.
Yeah, those are some great points that you two bring up. Yeah, the Internet of Things is going to be a huge portion of everyday lives in the future. Like you said, Yishang, like the like cars and moving to electronic cars, like those chips are going to be very important, especially for like even like if self-driving cars get on the market today. I've been hearing a lot about those. We'll see what happens there. And the CHIPS Act will have, like I said, will have a big impact on that. Well, that now concludes the questions portion of our podcast. See you on the conclusion. Well, that concludes our podcast on the recent CHIPS Act. It was great to discuss with you two about this topic and the possible outcomes of this executive order. What did you two think about this podcast overall?
I think this podcast is great. This act is definitely impacting millions of people's, their lives, about their future, their career decisions, and and also, we all care about, the politics, whether the situation may become more unstable in the future years, or will remain stable as well. So I think we, not only the electrical engineers, software engineers, but also the normal people who care about politics and investment should focus on this act further. And I think this podcast will help as a good resource for them to get to know this material.
Yeah, as you Oh,
So sorry.
sorry.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Chris.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, as Yicheng was saying, I think this is a good podcast to help inform like both the general public and other people in technology about what the CHIPS Act is. Yeah, thank you for having me on this podcast, Chris.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it was great having you two on board today. Yeah, definitely some great topics about the CHIPS Act, like definitely affects even just like software engineers like Yishang, or even just like everyday people that are outside of technology like Isha. Like it affects both audiences. But yeah, that concludes our podcast. Next week on our computing ethics podcast, we're going to be discussing the robot artist that spoke in front of Parliament the other day called Ida. Seems pretty interesting. So yeah, hopefully you got all listening can tune in to this next week. Thanks, guys.
See you next week.
All right, see you. Bye.